things that make me happy are when I've not got to look at a clock.
And eating good food really makes me happy.
Just being here, really. It's just life is good, isn't it?
Just getting what you want.
She makes me happy. The sunshine, music, just being, I don't know, healthy.
I like to party, I like to go out.
Hang out with friends, going dancing.
I guess money also makes you happy.
Something where you're not relying on money.
My cat.
My nephew.
My wife makes me very happy. And drinking.
A lying. So being comfortable.
Sleeping, really.
And movies as well.
Watching Liverpool beat Man United away.
Just be drunk.
I don't actually know what makes me happy.
More to life.
More to life.
I'd like to think there's more to life than this.
I often wonder if there is. I don't think there's more to life.
I'd like to think there is, though.
I don't know really.
Don't know everything that goes on in life, do you? So,
Yes, I do think there's more to life than this.
I don't know, really.
I was born and bred in Luton, which is a beautiful town just north of London. And I always feel like I have to apologise for that. Luton is one of those places which, at first glance, appears to have very few redeeming features. But let me tell you, once you scratch beneath the surface, it has none, actually. But it's my hometown, I dearly love it. And sometimes in places like that, you just have to look a little bit harder for the beauty. So this is actually a picture from outside the front of my house of the shop that we used to look out onto when we were growing up. And if you look very closely at this picture, you will see, it doesn't look great. I mean, actually, those are concrete bollards that you use to stop ram raids. And there were quite a few ram raids when I was growing up on that shop. I wasn't involved in any way. But you'll see that someone's actually taken the trouble of painting those bollards green. You know, that's actually the care and attention to detail. So there is beauty if you look for it. And my parents had been missionaries in China before I was born, and they'd returned to England. So church and faith were kind of part of my faith, part of my life from a really young age. And I went to quite a rough school in Luton. It was actually known as the worst school in Luton, which is quite a difficult accolade to achieve. And it's what these days you would call a failing school, mainly because it failed and they knocked it down. But when I arrived there, I realised quite quickly that I was one of only 2 or 3 people who went to church or had any kind of faith. And it suddenly hit me, lots of people don't believe this stuff that I've been brought up with. Isn't part of their lives in any way. And at the same time, all the kind of people my age at church stopped coming, and I suddenly had to make a decision for myself based on the evidence. I couldn't just kind of pretend what I'd been brought up with was true if it wasn't. I had to make a decision on the evidence, what I actually believed about Jesus. Was all this stuff I've been brought up with real? Was it true? I couldn't just believe something that wasn't true. I couldn't put my head in the sand and just pretend if it was true. I couldn't take some kind of blind jump of faith. I needed some evidence. For me personally, evidence has always been very important. After Luton, I went on to read law at Oxford. And actually, I studied and worked as a lawyer for 10 years. And I worked as a barrister specialising in criminal law. I defended people accused of crimes. And over the course of a number of years, I defended hundreds, probably over 1,000 people accused of criminal offences. It's really nice to see so many of you here tonight. But every case I worked on, the first question was always, what is the evidence about the events? How does the case stack up? The question I asked for years was, what is the evidence? And when it comes to who is Jesus, I'm convinced by the evidence. But what evidence is there? Well, you can't prove Christianity mathematically. You can't prove it scientifically. Science, of course, answers the questions how and when. It doesn't answer the questions who and why. I mean, suppose, for example, I invited you over to my house. We've only just met, but you seem like a really nice crowd. And you came in, and the kettle was boiling in my kitchen. And this is a kettle, just so you know. And you might say to me, well, why is the kettle boiling? And there's a couple of ways I could answer that question. I could say, well, actually, the kettle's boiling because there's a heat source in it, and there's a transfer of thermal energy across the container wall. That means that there is heat passing into the fluid and causing an increase in the mean square velocity of the molecules proportionate to the temperature. And when that hits 100 degrees, there's a collective phase transition by which the condensed liquid expands into a gaseous state. That would be one answer. But I could just say, oh, the kettle's boiling because I wanted to make you a cup of tea. Now, the first answer tells you what is happening, how it's happening. But the second answer tells you who and why. That I'm making a cup of tea because I want to make you a cup of tea. And there are some things that actually only the maker can reveal. Science is so important, but it reveals how things happened, and it doesn't tell us who and why. And the questions who and why are a matter of faith, actually. It takes as much faith to be an atheist as it does to be a Christian, because you can't prove that there is no God scientifically, just as you can't prove that there is a God scientifically. It's a matter of looking at the evidence. And I want to look at the historical evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. For lawyers, historical evidence is hugely important. That's what you put before a jury. The jury weren't there when the events happened. Every time they bring in a verdict, they have to take just a step of faith based on the historical evidence, based on the evidence they've heard. And I myself could not be a Christian if it required me taking a blind leap of faith without any evidence. For me, it's a question of taking a step of faith based on good historical evidence about the life, the death, and the resurrection of Jesus. And sometimes people say, well, hang on a minute, why are we talking about Jesus? I don't even believe there's a God. Why are we suddenly talking about Jesus? And I understand that. It might seem like putting the cart before the horse. But what I want to suggest is that if I want to know you, I can know a certain amount about you by looking at you, by studying you, and all those sorts of things. But ultimately, I can only know you if you choose to reveal yourself to me. And it's the same with God. We can only know God if he chooses to reveal himself to us. And the claim of the New Testament is that God has done that, and he's done it kind of in a way that you might expect or which makes sense. Because if God is going to reveal himself to us as human beings, what's the logical way to do that? Is to become a human being. And for me, it's actually the life, the death, and in particular the resurrection of Jesus that convinces me that this world has a creator, and that creator is to be viewed through the lens of Jesus. So what's the evidence? How do we know, for example, that Jesus even existed? Well, the answer is that we do know Jesus existed. There's overwhelming historical evidence that Jesus existed. First of all, outside the New Testament, the Roman historian Tacitus talks directly about Jesus. The Roman historian Suetonius talks indirectly about him. The first century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus says, now there was about this time Jesus, a wise man, if it's lawful to call him a man. For he was a doer of wonderful works, a teacher of such men as received the truth with pleasure. He drew over to him both many of the Jews and many of the Gentiles. And then he goes on to talk about his crucifixion and his alleged resurrection. So there's evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but far more importantly, there's evidence inside the New Testament. And some people say, well, the New Testament was written a long time ago. How do we know that what they wrote has not been changed over the years? And the answer is that we do know very accurately through the science of textual criticism what the original writers wrote. And essentially the way this works is that the more manuscripts we have and the closer in time they are to the original, the more sure we can be about the original. So here's a few examples for you. Firstly, Herodotus and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copy we have is AD 900. There's a 1300-year time lapse, and we have 8 copies of each, and no classical scholar would doubt their authenticity. Tacitus, there's a 1,000-year time gap. We have 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, a 950-year time lapse, 9 to 10 copies. Livy's Roman History, a 900-year gap, 20 copies. But when it comes to the New Testament, it is unique amongst ancient documents, both for the sheer number of manuscripts and their closeness in time to the original. So the New Testament was written between 40 and 100 AD. We have manuscript evidence as early as AD 130 and full manuscripts by AD 350. And we have 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin manuscripts, and 9,300 others. And that's why the classical scholar F.J. Hort, an expert in these things, says in the variety and fullness of the evidence on which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient prose writings. And again, no secular historian would disagree with that conclusion. So we know from evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed, but who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a human body. He ate, he drank, he sweated, he got tired, he suffered pain. He had human emotions, love, joy, sadness. He had human experiences. He had the experience of growing up in a family, of education, of having a job, of being tempted, bereavement, suffering, being tortured, and the experience of death. And many today would say, okay, well, he was a human being, but he was no more than a human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but no more than that. So what evidence is there to suggest that Jesus was more than just a great religious teacher? Well, there are two parts to this argument, really, because the first part is, who did Jesus think he was? Because if Jesus didn't think he was any more than a great religious teacher, that's the end of the argument. And some people say, well, Jesus never claimed to be God. And it's true, he didn't go around with a t-shirt on saying, I am God. But I think when you look at everything he taught and said, I think there's little doubt he was conscious of being a man whose identity was God. So that's the first part of the argument. And then secondly, was he right? What evidence is there to support his claims? So firstly, what did he say about himself? Well, the teaching of Jesus centered on himself. Most great religious teachers, they point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. But Jesus, in pointing people to himself, pointed them towards God. He said, it's through me that you come into a relationship with God. And I don't know what position you're in tonight. I don't know how you're feeling tonight. But I've been in a position where I've been thinking life's going really well. I've had a job I've loved. I've been earning lots of money. I've had great holidays, a great life, really enjoying things. I worked for a number of years as a barrister. I really love working as a barrister. It was really great fun representing interesting people who've done interesting things or alleged to have done interesting things. And it was quite fun as well, because you go to parties, and if you say you're a barrister at a party, people are actually really interested in you. They're interested in the fact you represent criminals. They want to know what those people are like, and you have all these really interesting conversations. And to be honest, if they knew anything about my area, if they knew anything, I had the privilege of working with some amazing people, some of the best people in my area at doing what they did. And so if they knew the name of my company, it was even better, because they'd say, oh, you work with them. They're brilliant. You must be brilliant. And I'd say, no. But inside I was thinking, yes. A little bit proud. And so I had all these great things in my life. And things that were good things, things that were great, things that I could enjoy. But it seemed to me that even with all those things in my life, I just wanted more. I wanted more success at work. I wanted more money. I wanted more fun holidays. It was like I had this spiritual hunger which I couldn't satisfy. And Jesus said, I am the bread of life. If you come to me, that hunger will be satisfied. And that's what I found. And then there's the stuff in my life I don't like, the bad habits, the stuff I find very addictive. Say for example, comparing yourself to people, or using Instagram, which is basically the same thing. And sometimes it can be great, sometimes it can get you down a bit, because you're often comparing your behind the scenes with everyone else's highlight reel. And you're there on Instagram, I find, can be very addictive. It's not that bad, but there's lots of things I've struggled with over the years. And Jesus said, if the Son, talking about himself, sets you free, if Jesus sets you free, you'll be free indeed. And that's also my experience, that Jesus set me free from stuff, like a bad temper. I used to have such a bad temper. And some of the things he set me free from, it's just gone straight away, like that. Some of the things, it's been a much longer process. And then there's stuff like guilt, worry, anxiety, fear. I wonder if you've ever had that experience that I've had of, say for example, making a mistake at work or a relationship seems to be going wrong. And you wake up at 2:00 in the morning and you can't get back to sleep, and you just think, is this going to be okay? What if there's no way out of this? What if it can't be saved? And Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You'll find peace. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. If you welcome me, you welcome God. If you've seen me, you've seen God. And we've all probably known people in our lives, those people who perhaps haven't been given a huge amount of modesty and humility, seem to think they're God's gift to the world, and think maybe to see what God looks like, they'd only have to look in the mirror. You might have had a boss like that, or an ex. And the thing is, Jesus didn't have a trace of arrogance in his nature, and yet he said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me. So firstly, his teaching centered on himself. But secondly, his indirect claims. Jesus put himself in a position which only God could be in. So for example, Jesus said to people who he'd never met before, your sins are forgiven. And the lawyers said, wait a minute, to forgive those who sinned against others, that's something only God can do. Who do you think you are? And Jesus said, I've come to die for your sins, to make forgiveness possible. Right at the heart of Christianity is forgiveness. To be a Christian is to forgive the inexcusable in others because God has forgiven the inexcusable in me. And then the third piece of evidence is his direct claims, if you like. And I don't have time to look at all of them, but if somebody says to you, Jesus never claimed to be God, and you've only got time to show them one verse, show them this one. And the background is that a claim tantamount to a claim to be God was considered blasphemy in the eyes of the religious leaders, and it was considered worthy of death by stoning. And Jesus says this in verse John 10:30. I and the Father are one. Again, they picked up stones to stone him. Then Jesus said to them, I have shown you many great miracles from the Father. For which of these do you stone me? We're not stoning you for any of these, they replied, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere human being, claim to be God. So those who were around him, those who heard him, those who opposed him, said, you're claiming to be God. They were in no doubt about what Jesus was claiming, and they said he deserved to die for it. So who did Jesus think he was? It seems that from his teaching, that his indirect and direct claims, the evidence is that Jesus did claim to be God. Now obviously, that is a remarkable claim, and it needs to be tested. And it seems to me that there are three possibilities. The first is that it wasn't true, and Jesus knew it was untrue, in which case he was an imposter, he was a fraudster, and an evil one at that. The second possibility, it wasn't true, and he really didn't realize it. He genuinely thought he was God, even though he wasn't. And we would call someone like that deluded or insane. But the only other logical possibility is that it was true. C.S. Lewis put it like this. A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said wouldn't be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else he's insane or something worse. But don't let us come up with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He hasn't left that open to us. He didn't intend to. So was Jesus right in what he claimed? What evidence is there to support what he said? The first thing to look at is his teaching. So the teaching of Jesus is widely considered to be the greatest teaching of all time. Love your neighbor as yourself. Do to others what you would have do to them. And then this, completely revolutionary. He was the first person to say it. Love your enemies. And Jesus' teaching has really been the foundation of our entire civilization in the West. Many of our laws were originally based on the teaching of Jesus. And then think about this. We've advanced in almost every field of science. Just think about the technological advancements, even of the last 10 years. Brain implants, nanotechnology, Tinder. But in 2,000 years, no one's ever improved on the moral teaching of Jesus. They're the greatest words ever spoken. They're the kind of words you'd expect God to speak. And then his life, the things he did. He must have been the most extraordinary person to be around. I mean, sometimes people say, well, Christianity's boring. It wouldn't have been boring hanging out with Jesus. I just want you to imagine for a moment you're facing a serious moral dilemma. Maybe an ethical issue at work. You're not sure what the right thing is to do. And you've got one call. Who do you phone? Who's your go-to, sensible, wise, calm in a crisis friend? Just picture that person for a moment. And then I want you to imagine it's a Friday afternoon and you've just had the most amazing piece of news. This is brilliant news. And you just want to go out, you want to hit the town, and you want to party. And you've got one call. Who's your go-to party friend that you would just long to hang out with on that Friday night, okay? In my mind, for me, they're two very different people. I would never want to mix those two people up. It would get very messy. I'd phone about a problem at work and I'd end up at Shoreditch at 4 a.m. It's not good. But the thing is about Jesus is he doesn't just have the best teaching that the world has ever seen, but he went to a party and the wine ran out. So he says, well, you see those stone jars over there, fill them up with 20 or 30 gallons of bathwater each and start pouring them out for the guests. And they did, and it was the best wine of the night. It might surprise you, Jesus was the one who kept the party going. And not just his miracles, but his love for the loveless. His love for people who society had written off and excluded. The way he set people free and still sets people free today. And of course, I suppose, ultimately his death, laying down his life for his friends. And then his character. The character of Jesus has impressed millions of people who wouldn't call themselves Christians. Time magazine said this: Jesus is the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of Western humanity. His enemies could find no fault with him, and his friends who knew him best said this guy is without sin. But as I'm sure you know, the real test of character is what you're like when you're seriously under pressure. When you do make a mistake at work and people are screaming at you. When the relationship in which you'd put all your hopes falls apart. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said, Father, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. Then there's his fulfillment of Old Testament prophecy. No one else in the history of humanity has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were born. Jesus fulfilled over 300 Old Testament prophecies spoken by different voices over hundreds of years, 29 of them in a single day. And some might say, well, okay, but surely, Jesus read the Old Testament. Maybe he was a clever con man. He went through and he thought, I'll go and fulfill these prophecies. But it doesn't work, not only because of the sheer number of prophecies, but also because there were many things he simply had no control over. There were prophecies about the exact manner of his death, about the place of his burial, even about the place of his birth. I mean, imagine Jesus picking up the Bible and saying, I'm supposed to be born in Bethlehem. It's too late. But he was born in Bethlehem, something he had absolutely no control over. And then, and by far the most important, his conquest of death. I mean, the physical resurrection from the dead of Jesus is the cornerstone of Christianity. And it's so relevant to every single one of us here. I mean, every one of us is going to die. I always feel a little bit awkward bringing that up on a Wednesday night. But it's the ultimate statistic. 1 in 1 of us in this room will die. And I don't know if you've noticed, we find it quite difficult to talk about death. When a famous person dies, even in really tragic circumstances, the death is reported and then quite quickly we move on to talking about their life. It's like we can't sit with the tragic reality of death for more than a moment. We don't like to talk about death. I even heard of a hospital where they have forbidden the use of the word death. They've got a much more politically correct way of speaking about it. They talk about a negative patient care outcome. But the fact is, we die. And, like me, you've probably been deeply moved, shocked by the events of this week. And in a way, we all kind of relate to that because we know what it's like, each of us, to have lost someone close to us. I will never forget going to the funeral of my good friend Jamie, who died in really tragic circumstances. And I can still see, I just remember seeing his coffin and seeing it go into the ground. And it's just so bleak. It looks so final. It looks like the end. And it is the end. Unless death has been conquered. And that's the claim of the New Testament. that Jesus died and he was buried, and on the third day he was raised to life. And that means it's possible for each one of us to have eternal life. And that's an extraordinary claim. And it's the basis of hope of every funeral. But is it true? That's what matters. Just because it's nice to believe doesn't mean it's true. So why do I believe that Jesus rose from the dead? Well, I hadn't realized how much evidence there actually is for the physical resurrection of Jesus. And there are 4 reasons why I believe he rose from the dead. First of all, no one has ever really explained how Jesus' body was absent from the tomb on Easter Day. Some say, well, maybe the authorities took the body. But that's not at all likely, because if they had the body, all they had to do when people were running around saying, Jesus has risen from the dead, they say, no, he's not. We got him, here he is, and just wheel him out. Others have said, well, maybe the disciples stole the body. And then they began a rumor that Jesus had been resurrected. But the tomb was guarded. And it's also psychologically improbable. Here's a depressed, disillusioned group of people. Look at what they had to go through for their beliefs. Why would the disciples have been willing to be tortured and die for something that they would have known if they'd taken the body wasn't true? Some say, well, maybe robbers stole the body. But that's the least likely of all. I haven't actually talked about an empty tomb, because the tomb wasn't empty. Jesus' body was absent. But when the disciples got to the tomb, they found the grave clothes, which were the only valuable thing, the only thing for the robbers to take. They had collapsed like a caterpillar's cocoon when the butterfly emerges. And the headpiece that had been around Jesus' head had been folded up and put in a separate place. And when they saw that, they believed. A second reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is not only was Jesus absent from the tomb, he was present with his people. He was seen by many people on different occasions. Sometimes people say, well, that's hallucination. Yeah, people do hallucinate. The kind of people who hallucinate are highly strung, imaginative people, those who are on drugs. But among Jesus' disciples, you had Thomas, the ultimate skeptic. You had tough, gritty fishermen. You had Matthew, the tax collector. Tax collectors do not hallucinate. But in any event, it's highly unlikely that even 2 people would have the same hallucination. Jesus appeared on 11 separate occasions, on one occasion to more than 500 people at the same time. 500 people could not have the same hallucination. And then the third reason is the immediate impact. Here are a group of disciples who were discouraged, depressed, fearful, hiding, and something happened, something occurred that totally changed them. So that 3 days after his death, they were going around telling everyone, we've seen Jesus. Jesus is alive. And then you get this this kind of historical phenomenon we know about, which is the birth and growth of the Christian church. And it's an extraordinary phenomenon, without parallel really, in the history of the world, because beginning with a group of basically fishermen and tax collectors, there is this explosion in 300 years right across the known world. And it's a story of peaceful revolution with no parallel. And then the fourth reason I believe Jesus rose from the dead is the sheer number of people's lives which have been transformed by Jesus. More people today than ever before. Tens of thousands of people a day are placing their trust in Jesus. Today there are 300,000 Christians in the world, all testifying to an experience of Jesus and an encounter with Jesus. And then we have Christian experience down the ages, countless millions of people who have experienced the risen Jesus. And it's people of every ethnicity, continent, nationality, social, economic group, intellectual background, from all walks of life. They unite in this common experience of the risen Jesus. So when I look at the evidence, when I look at Jesus' claims, what he said about himself, who he said he was, his teaching, his life, the fulfillment of prophecy, his resurrection from the dead, to say he was evil and deluded, it just seems unbelievable, seems illogical. So I'm left with the only other option. When I look at the evidence, it gives the strongest possible support to Jesus being a man whose identity was God. But there is all the difference in the world between head knowledge and heart knowledge. Now, I can be convinced of something in my head without it making its way to my heart. And when I placed my trust in Jesus, that knowledge made its way from my head to my heart. I mean, Jesus said, I have come so you might have life and life in all its fullness. And I've had my ups and downs. I've been through difficulties. I've messed up more times than I care to remember. I am far from perfect. But I've experienced what Jesus promised. It really is true that God has revealed himself in Jesus. Jesus really is who he claimed to be. Jesus really did rise from the dead. There is hope beyond this life. There is hope for this life. Right now, in an encounter with Jesus, we find life and life in all its fullness. And that's my experience of what Jesus came to bring. And that's why I believe he is who he claimed to be.